The Allied invasion of Normandy required not only bravery on the beaches but an astonishing feat of maritime and engineering improvisation. In the initial days after D-Day, there were no deep-water ports available to handle the flood of men and equipment coming ashore. Yet within 48 hours, more than 130,000 American soldiers and 17,000 vehicles had landed. The demand for supplies grew exponentially. By D+4, the force required 6,000 tons per day, by D+10, 9,000 tons, and by D+16, over 12,000 tons. Over the next 2 months, 1.2 million Americans, 250,000 vehicles, and more than 5 million tons of supplies and equipment were put ashore. To handle this torrent without a port, Allied engineers employed landing ship tanks, LSTs, landing craft tanks, LCTs, amphibious trucks, WWIIs, and small harbor craft in a coordinated ballet of supply. LSTs, though derisively known as large slow targets, could carry about 100 soldiers and 16 to 19 vehicles across oceans and then nose onto the beach to unload. LCTs ferried tanks and artillery pieces from ship to shore. WWII amphibious trucks swam ashore with 5,000 pounds of cargo and then drove inland at 45 miles per hour. This logistical choreography kept the beachhead supplied until permanent ports could be captured. At the strategic level, planners recognized that landing craft alone could not sustain a million-man army. If the Allies could not capture a working port, they would have to build one and take it with them. Thus were born the Mulberry Harbors, portable concrete and steel structures towed across the channel. A committee of engineers under civil engineer Colin R. White studied designs for breakwaters, roadways, and piers. On 2 September 1943, the combined chiefs of staff estimated that these artificial ports would need to handle 12,000 tons per day in all weather. Work began immediately. Shipyards and beaches around Britain fabricated caissons, phoenixes, floating roadways, whales, and landing pierheads. At Arromanches and Omaha, the elements were assembled after D-Day. The Mulberry Bee Harbor at Gold Beach proved crucial. It operated for 10 months, during which over 2 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles were landed before it was decommissioned. The artificial harbor absorbed the shock of storms that destroyed the American Mulberry A and allowed LSTs and Liberty ships to unload in relatively calm waters. Its roadways flexed with the waves, bearing the weight of Sherman tanks and lorries. Without the Mulberry, the early months of the Allied campaign would have been starved of ammunition and rations. This miracle of over-the-shore logistics was seldom celebrated. The names of the civil engineers, naval officers, and Royal Navy hydrographers who surveyed beaches under enemy fire rarely appear in popular histories. Yet their contributions were every bit as daring as the paratroopers who dropped behind enemy lines. They illustrated that planning for supply is as strategic as planning for battle. The temporary harbors were not perfect. Storms and German sabotage damaged them, but they bought time until Cherbourg and Antwerp could be opened. They demonstrated that the Allies could innovate on a massive scale under pressure, designing equipment to solve new logistical problems rather than relying on improvisation alone. They also exemplified the partnership between nations. British engineers built the breakwaters, American engineers constructed the roadways, and both navies towed and protected the pieces across the channel. In this sense, the Mulberry Harbors and over-the-shore logistics were a microcosm of the global logistics system that underpinned victory. They laughed at American trucks until logistics won the war. In the popular imagination, the Second World War was won by the clash of extraordinary weapons and decisive battles. Cinema and video games have fed this view for decades. Panzers roaring through French villages, Messerschmitts diving out of the sun, British Spitfires spiraling toward the channel, American GIs storming beaches under a hail of machine gun fire. The iconic images are irresistible, but they do not tell the whole story. They mislead us about the deeper forces that turn campaigns and shape the destinies of nations. Behind the glamour of tanks and aircraft lay something far more humble: the truck, the railway wagon, the pipeline, the warehouse. German generals obsessed over firepower and tactics. Their staff schools devoted hours to the placement of artillery and the coordination of armor columns, but only a fraction of the syllabus to the problem of moving fuel and rations to the front. They trusted that their columns could live off the land, or that success would come so swiftly that supply would never catch up. They were wrong. The American army, by contrast, built an enormous supply system before a single US soldier landed on Normandy's beaches. It mobilized industries in Michigan and factories in Pennsylvania and shipyards along the coast to produce an avalanche of trucks, jerrycans, canned food, and spare parts. When Allied planners prepared for Operation Overlord, they spent as much energy on how to feed, fuel, clothe, and transport their forces as on how to destroy German fortifications. While German commanders boasted about their Tiger tanks, thick armor, and 88mm guns, American officers were drawing up one-way road systems and converting British ports into vast supply depots. Germans laughed at American trucks. They saw them as ungainly, underpowered, and unheroic. But as the war dragged on and blitzkrieg stalled in seas of mud, those trucks became the lifeline that kept Allied armies advancing across Europe. The story of how logistics, not just firepower, won the war challenges the myth that the side with the best guns inevitably prevails. It reveals how the United States' capacity to deliver fuel, food, and spare parts, not just bombs and bullets, shattered the Third Reich. The tale begins with a contradiction. The German army set the standard for modern warfare with its daring armored thrusts, yet remained stuck in a 19th century supply system. Its opponents, derided as a nation of mechanics more skilled at building refrigerators than weapons, patiently built a machine of movement that could cross oceans, feed millions, and outlast the fury of blitzkrieg. As we peel back the myths, we will find that the quiet heroes of World War II were not only generals but mechanics, stevedores, truck drivers, railway engineers, and production managers. In telling this story, we will see that wars are not simply contests of brilliance but tests of endurance, systems, and planning. The contrast sets the tension for our journey. On one side, Germany's obsession with tanks and engineering prowess. On the other, America's focus on trucks, fuel, and logistics. Which approach would determine the war's outcome? By the end of this documentary, you will see how the Allies' unheroic assets, convoys of trucks, convoys of ships, and convoys of pipeline engineers, undermined the very foundation of the Axis war effort. The myth of weapon superiority will crumble under the weight of supply records and diaries from exhausted drivers. The story will not be romanticized, for the truth needs no exaggeration. It will simply unfold, calm, factual, and emotionally grounded. To understand why the German High Command underestimated logistics, we must look back to the interwar years. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany with a humiliated army and severe restrictions on its equipment. To circumvent these restrictions, German officers focused on mobility and shock. They studied the First World War's static stalemate and concluded that the next war had to be fast, mobile, and decisive. The concept that emerged in the 1930s, blitzkrieg or lightning war, soon emphasized surprise, concentration of force, rapid penetration, and encirclement. Tanks, dive bombers, and radio communications were the stars of this doctrine. However, blitzkrieg contained a significant blind spot. German planners assumed that operations would be short or that logistics would take care of themselves. Training at the Kriegsakademie, War Academy, was weighted heavily toward tactics. According to a U.S. Army liaison officer, out of more than 40 hours of weekly instruction, only about 2 hours focused on logistics. Officers were taught to expect their armored units to forage for supplies in occupied territories. Rarely did the curriculum address how to deliver thousands of gallons of gasoline to panzers hundreds of miles from the supply base. In the words of one observer, the German army had not figured out how to supply tanks with the enormous fuel they required. Another blind spot lay in Germany's reliance on horses. Despite the image of modern motorized warfare, the Wehrmacht entered the Second World War with more than 500,000 horses. By mid-1944, horses pulled 2/3 of its vehicles and provided 80% of the army's motive power. Soldiers' memoirs recall that artillery and equipment were still being hauled by horses when panzers were racing ahead. Horses required fodder and rest, limiting the pace of operations. In Operation Barbarossa, up to 750,000 horses and mules were used. They clogged roads and forced mechanized formations to slow to a crawl. German commanders never seriously considered replacing horses, partly due to shortages of fuel and rubber. This reliance on animal power meant that blitzkrieg could advance only as fast as the horse-drawn columns could follow. German logistics failures were not merely technical, they were cultural. The German general staff prided itself on operational art and tactical brilliance. Logistics officers were considered second-rate. Their concerns were something to be left to quartermasters. In pre-war maneuvers, commanders practiced offensive thrusts without fully integrating supply. When war came, the results were predictable. In Poland and France, the rapid victories masked the cracks in the supply system. Once operations extended deeper into the Soviet Union, those cracks widened. During Operation Barbarossa, supply columns had to traverse vast distances over primitive roads. The Soviet railway network used a different gauge, requiring captured lines to be converted before they could be used. Fuel and ammunition were moved by lorries and horse-drawn wagons over dirt tracks that turned to mud after rain. Winter brought another catastrophe. Lubricants froze, vehicles stalled, and winter clothing was delayed. The German army had not planned for a long campaign and lacked cold weather gear. Logistics became a massive headache, and the initial shock of Blitzkrieg gave way to a grinding war of attrition that Germany was ill-prepared to sustain. In the years leading up to 1939, Hitler often boasted that his enemies produced only refrigerators and automobiles. By focusing on tanks and guns, he misread the meaning of industrial power. The United States had a larger national income than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. When Franklin Roosevelt began rearming the nation in 1940, he poured funding into factories and shipyards. He recruited executives from Detroit to oversee military production. That industrial buildup would soon supply not only American forces but also Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through the Lend-Lease program. While German leaders glorified offensive weapons, Roosevelt and his advisors put their faith in mass production and the ability to sustain operations for years. Few pieces of equipment were as unglamorous yet as decisive as the U.S. Army's 212-ton truck. Nicknamed Deuce and a Half, this six-wheel drive vehicle became the backbone of Allied logistics. Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton praised it as one of the war's most valuable weapons. Standardized parts allowed mass production and quick repairs. Drivers could be trained relatively quickly, and the truck's reliability meant convoys could run for days without major breakdowns. In the early 1940s, American factories produced more than 2.4 million trucks for the armed services. These vehicles hauled everything from ammunition and fuel to mail and rations. German officers scoffed at the American focus on trucks. In their eyes, a tank could win a battle, a truck merely carried the tank's fuel. Yet the correlation was obvious: a tank without fuel was just a bunker. German tank divisions often ran out of gasoline after a few days, forcing them to stop and wait for resupply. American divisions, by contrast, were generally able to maintain momentum because they had dedicated supply units and a robust fleet of transports. Fuel was the lifeblood of mechanized armies. The U.S. military measured consumption not in barrels, but in rivers. During the Normandy invasion, the Allied forces burned 148,000 gallons of gasoline per day in June and 372,000 gallons per day in July. After the breakout, consumption rose to 800,000 gallons per day. Each armored division required about 800 tons of supplies per day. To meet this staggering demand, planners insisted on stockpiling jerrycans, building pipelines, and securing port facilities. Spare parts were equally critical. Tanks and trucks wore out quickly on rough roads. Without replacement engines, tires, and transmissions, the army would bog down as surely as a tank stuck in mud. The Allied logistics machine was global. Oil from Texas and Venezuela was shipped to refineries and then to the front. Rubber from Southeast Asia was largely cut off by Japanese conquests, prompting the U.S. to launch a massive synthetic rubber program. Before the war, the United States had about 1 million tons of natural rubber stockpiled, while consumption exceeded 600,000 tons per year. To fill the gap, the government commissioned 51 synthetic rubber plants and by 1945 produced 920,000 tons annually. Without synthetic rubber for tires, the fleet of trucks powering the Red Ball Express and other supply operations never ran short of tires. It also freed Allied strategists from fear that their supply lines would collapse due to Japanese conquests. Cargo ships were essential to moving supplies around the world. Liberty ships were simple, rugged, and cheap to produce. More than 2,700 were built from 1941 to 1945, with an average of 3 ships launched every 2 days. These cargo vessels carried tanks, trucks, ammunition, and grain across the Atlantic, sustaining Allied forces and civilian populations. They were supplemented by larger and faster Victory ships. 534 were completed. Each voyage delivered thousands of tons of supplies, and each lost ship required new production to replace. The sheer scale of shipbuilding underscored America's focus on sustaining the war rather than simply winning quick battles. Fuel had to be moved not only across oceans but also across the English Channel and up to front lines. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, laid flexible pipes on the sea floor between England and France. By war's end, Pluto pumped more than 172 million gallons of gasoline to the continent. Engineers considered it as daring as the construction of the artificial Mulberry harbors because it allowed fuel to flow continuously without exposing tankers to submarines and storms. Feeding armies and allies was another logistic challenge. Through Lend-Lease, the United States shipped over 3 million tons of food to the Soviet Union and provided about 10% of Britain's food supply. Meat, sugar, canned fruits, and flour kept civilians and soldiers alive, enabling them to keep fighting. Germany, by contrast, expected conquered territories to feed its soldiers, leading to starvation and resentment among occupied populations. The Red Ball Express stands as the most famous logistic operation of the Western Front. In the summer of 1944, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France. Patton's Third Army burned through fuel at a furious rate, sometimes 400,000 gallons per day. The French railway network lay in ruins after pre-invasion bombing and sabotage. Ports like Cherbourg were still clearing mines and repairing cranes. Trucks were the only way to move supplies quickly from the beaches to the front. On 25 August 1944, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force created a dedicated truck convoy system known as the Red Ball Express. Red balls painted on vehicles and signposts indicated priority routes, a reference to railroad symbols for fast freight. Within 36 hours, 3,558 trucks from 67 companies were organized into convoys. Drivers were ordered to maintain a strict schedule. The road formed a one-way loop roughly 300 miles long. Loaded trucks went out on one road and returned on another. Within 4 days, the express expanded to 132 companies operating 5,158 vehicles and hauling more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day. At its peak, it employed about 23,000 drivers and mechanics. Most of those drivers were African American. The U.S. Army was segregated, and African American soldiers were often assigned to service units. Approximately 70% of the Red Ball Express personnel were black. They faced discrimination, inadequate training, and occasional hostility from white officers. Yet without their labor, the supply line would have collapsed. A contemporary Stars and Stripes article acknowledged that Negro outfits delivered gas under constant fire and had what it takes. Many drivers saw the express as part of a broader fight for dignity, a chance to prove their worth while also demanding equal rights at home. Convoys were composed of dozens of deuce-and-a-half trucks loaded with jerrycans, ammunition, food, clothing, and spare parts. Drivers were instructed to keep their headlights off or covered with cat eyes, small slits that reduced visibility to prevent German aircraft from spotting them. Speed was set at 35 miles per hour, though drivers often exceeded that to meet deadlines. Trucks traveled nose to tail to avoid losing their way on dark, battered roads. Mechanics in the convoys repaired vehicles on the fly, cannibalizing parts when necessary. When a truck broke down, others would tow it to a maintenance point while continuing their run. Conditions were grueling. Drivers worked 18 to 20 hours per day and slept on the ground or in their cabs. According to an Army Transportation Corps article, drivers sometimes splashed water on their faces to stay awake and died with their hands still on the wheel. Trucks consumed enormous amounts of gasoline themselves, sometimes 300,000 gallons daily on the express's route. Bad roads and poor weather took a toll. Dust filled noses and clogged engines. Rain turned roads into quagmires. There were too few tow trucks and not enough maps. Theft of supplies was a problem, as were accidents and ambushes. Drivers became adept at improvisation, replacing blown gaskets with strips of cloth, using wire to hold mufflers in place, and following their sense of direction when road signs were missing. The strain on the drivers was immense. Many were teenagers with minimal training. Racism added to their stress, as black drivers often felt undervalued by a white command structure. Some truckers, exhausted and frustrated, deliberately sabotaged their own vehicles to get a rest. To improve morale, the Army organized entertainment shows and distributed magazines. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of unity and endurance. Yanks magazine described how drivers worked through rain, heat, and enemy fire, saying they splashed water on their face to keep awake and sometimes died at the wheel. The Express operated for 82 days from late August to November 1944. On average, about 900 vehicles were on the road each day, delivering 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Over its lifetime, it transported more than 412,000 tons to 28 divisions. Another source records deliveries of over 400,000 tons, while yet another counts 135,000 tons delivered between August 29th and September 15th alone. The difference in figures reflects different measurement periods and highlights the sheer scale of the operation. It was, as Time magazine reported, part of the miracle of supply, something the Germans could not understand. The United States was the most mechanized military in the world, while German units still relied heavily on horses. German commanders were aware of their logistical weaknesses but believed that quick victories would mitigate them. They thought Allied armies were cumbersome and would be unable to sustain fast advances. When they witnessed the Red Ball Express and other American supply operations, they were stunned. Intelligence reports noted that the Allies had set aside entire highways for supply convoys and that trucks moved day and night. The volume of supplies dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could muster. The Germans attempted to destroy supply lines with aircraft and V-1 rockets, but American air superiority and anti-aircraft defenses protected the convoys. By 1944, the German fuel situation was desperate. Allied bombing targeted synthetic fuel plants and oil refineries. Attacks on Ploiești, Romania, which supplied about 30% of Axis petroleum, severely damaged installations. Though the immediate reduction in output was limited, ongoing raids forced Germany to disperse production and relocate plants underground. By late 1944, Allied attacks on fuel plants and transport networks had reduced German fuel output to only 8% of its April level. Tank units often had to train without real fuel, some operated on captured stocks. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Field Marshal Georg von Rundstedt's armies began the offensive with only 6 days' worth of fuel. The plan relied on capturing Allied fuel dumps to keep moving. American truck drivers responded by evacuating fuel from forward depots, leaving only empty drums for the Germans. Panzer spearheads ran out of gasoline, and units abandoned tanks on the roadside. Hitler's last throw of the dice failed not because the Tiger tank was inferior, but because there was not enough fuel to feed it. The German rail network was another weakness. Allied bombers targeted rail yards, bridges, and rolling stock. Severed lines forced supplies onto the roads, which were already congested with troops and refugees. Horse-drawn wagons could not keep up with mechanized units. When winter came, horses needed more feed, which further taxed the supply system. In the east, the mismatch of rail gauges between Germany and the Soviet Union meant that each captured rail line had to be converted before use. By the end of the war, more than 1 million horses remained in service. They were a symbol of the regime's failure to modernize its supply lines. Some German officers recognized their errors after the war. They acknowledged that the training of officers should have emphasized logistics as much as tactics. They admitted that the decision to invade the Soviet Union without adequate winter clothing and fuel stocks was catastrophic. Others blamed Hitler's interference or the Allied bombing campaign. Yet the structural problem was deeper. The Third Reich never mobilized its economy fully for a prolonged war until it was too late. By the time Albert Speer, the armaments minister, centralized production in 1943, Allied bombers were already destroying factories faster than they could be rebuilt. The impact of logistics on combat operations becomes clear when we examine the Normandy campaign. After D-Day, Allied forces were hemmed in by the hedgerows of northern France. German resistance was fierce and progress was slow. Supply dumps quickly became congested. At one point, 12,000 tons of supplies were being moved through Normandy each day, and vehicle traffic reached 1,000 vehicles per hour. Fuel consumption skyrocketed as commanders ordered tanks to blast hedgerows and trucks to shuttle ammunition to the front. When Operation Cobra broke the German line at St. Lo, the Allied advance suddenly accelerated. Trucks raced forward to keep up, and the Red Ball Express was created in response. Without that logistical improvisation, Patton's Third Army would have stalled. General Patton personified the importance of supply. He loved speed and sought to exploit German disarray by driving across France and into Germany. But his tanks drank gasoline. During the rapid advance, Patton begged his superiors for more fuel. He offered to siphon fuel from less mobile divisions and even considered raiding British depots. In early September, his tanks came to a halt east of the Moselle River because the supply line could not keep up. This pause allowed the Germans to regroup and set up defenses at Metz. The delay illustrates that logistics, not enemy fire, determined the pace of advance. When fuel flows resumed thanks to the Red Ball Express and newly captured ports, Patton pushed forward again. Allied commanders sometimes overestimated their logistic capacity. In September 1944, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden, an airborne armored offensive aiming to capture bridges over the Rhine and drive into the Ruhr. The plan required long, narrow supply lines to feed a single thrust through the Netherlands. The Red Ball Express and other convoys were already stretched. When German resistance was stronger than expected and bridges were blown, supply trucks could not reach the front. Fuel rationing slowed tanks, and airborne units ran short of ammunition. The operation failed, in part because logistic planners could not simultaneously support multiple major offensives. The lesson was that even a well-resourced army had limits and that supply must dictate strategy. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the interplay of German desperation and Allied logistics. Hitler aimed to cut the Allied front in two and capture the port of Antwerp. The operation relied on speed and surprise, but also on seizing American fuel. Rundstedt's armored columns had only 6 days of fuel at the start. American intelligence underestimated the threat, but logistic units responded quickly once the offensive began. Truck drivers evacuated fuel depots to prevent them from falling into German hands. They scuttled jerrycans, destroyed pumps, and set warehouses on fire. German spearheads captured some fuel, but not enough to sustain momentum. Panzers outran their supply trains and were forced to stop as gasoline ran out. German traffic jams, exacerbated by horse-drawn transports, clogged the narrow Ardennes roads. The offensive stalled and the Allies counterattacked. Logistics and the lack thereof, not the thickness of armor, shaped the outcome. By the autumn of 1944, the cumulative effect of Allied logistics and German shortages led to the collapse of German forces in Western Europe. The liberation of Antwerp and the clearing of the Scheldt estuary opened a major deep-water port. Fuel pipelines extended from the Normandy beaches across France, pumping millions of gallons. The Red Ball Express was scaled back as railways were repaired, but the lessons remained. In March 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine. They advanced rapidly into the heart of Germany, outrunning their supply lines at times but able to slow down and resupply because there was no longer effective opposition. German factories lay in ruins from bombing, and synthetic fuel plants produced only a trickle. Horses could not move heavy artillery fast enough. Germany's logistic system had collapsed, and with it the ability to resist. For American and Allied soldiers, the knowledge that food, mail, and ammunition would arrive regularly was a great source of morale. Letters from home reached the front lines. Cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee were distributed even in forward positions. Soldiers wrote home, praising the army's ability to provide hot meals after long marches. The presence of Red Ball convoys churning through mud and night served as a visible symbol that higher headquarters cared about them. Tank crews who worried about mechanical breakdowns saw mechanics bring spare parts within days. These comforts did not erase the horrors of combat, but they mitigated the feeling of abandonment. On the logistics side, morale was more complicated. Drivers and mechanics were exhausted. The monotony of driving at night, the constant danger of accidents, ambush, or falling asleep, and the lack of recognition wore them down. The Army Transportation Corps recorded that some drivers worked 20 hours a day and used water to stay awake. They sometimes died at the wheel. African American drivers faced discrimination and were assigned menial tasks when the war ended. Many felt their contributions were undervalued, even though the success of campaigns depended on them. After the war, some expressed bitterness that their service was forgotten, yet others took pride in their role, knowing that they made history's largest amphibious invasion possible. German morale deteriorated as supply shortages became severe. Letters home from Wehrmacht soldiers complained about lack of winter clothing, insufficient rations, and poor equipment. In the Soviet Union, entire divisions froze when lubricants turned to jelly. Troops trudged through snow without proper boots. As Allied bombing cut railway lines and oil plants, fuel rations were reduced. Drivers siphoned gasoline for personal use and engaged in black market trade. Panzer crews joked darkly that they would soon be riding bicycles. The sense that the state could no longer provide undermined loyalty. When the Red Army and Western Allies pierced Germany's borders in 1945, many soldiers surrendered, believing further resistance futile. By 1945, America's war industries had achieved output beyond anything previously seen. The nation produced over 96,000 bombers, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 6.5 million rifles, and billions of dollars worth of other war material. This avalanche of production was made possible by mobilizing the entire economy. President Roosevelt appointed William S. Knudsen, an executive from General Motors, to direct war production. Factories switched from making refrigerators and cars to building aircraft engines and guns. Women and minorities entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Executive Order 8802, signed in 1941, prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries, opening jobs to African Americans. Labor unions agreed to no strike pledges. The result was a surge in output that astonished even Germany's planners. Cargo ships were essential to moving supplies around the world. Liberty ships were simple, rugged, and cheap to produce. More than 2,700 were built from 1941 to 1945, with an average of 3 ships launched every 2 days. These cargo vessels carried tanks, trucks, ammunition, and grain across the Atlantic, sustaining Allied forces and civilian populations. They were supplemented by the Victory class, faster and better armed. 534 were built. The continuous stream of ships allowed the United States and Britain to sustain not only their own forces, but also those of the Soviet Union and other allies. The Lend-Lease program shipped tanks, trucks, locomotives, and food across the Atlantic and Pacific. Soviet soldiers fought with American Studebaker trucks and jammed U.S. Spam into their kits. British civilians ate canned meat, sugar, and powdered milk from America. These logistical flows were part of a vast system that dwarfed the scale of any previous war. The story of synthetic rubber exemplifies the industrial ingenuity behind Allied logistics. When the Japanese conquered Southeast Asia, they cut off 90% of the world's natural rubber supply. The United States had stockpiled about 1 million tons but consumed 600,000 tons annually. To fill the gap, the government created the Rubber Reserve Company, planning 51 synthetic rubber plants. By 1945, American factories were producing 920,000 tons of synthetic rubber each year. This program ensured that the massive fleet of trucks powering the Red Ball Express and other supply operations never ran short of tires. It also freed Allied strategists from fear that their supply lines would collapse due to Japanese conquests. Feeding both soldiers and civilians required coordinating global agriculture. The United States provided 10% of Britain's food supply, including meat, wheat, and fruit. It shipped 3,000 tons of food to the Soviet Union. Canning and dehydration techniques allowed rations to be preserved for long voyages. Clothing factories produced boots, uniforms, and winter coats. Meanwhile, Germany expected occupied territories to feed its soldiers and shipped millions of tons of food out of Eastern Europe, causing famine. This approach undermined the German war effort by generating partisan resistance and weakening the morale of conquered peoples. Operation Pluto showcased logistic innovation. Engineers laid 82 nautical miles of pipe across the channel, connecting Isle of Wight to Cherbourg and later to the French port of Dungeness. Flexible pipes made of lead and steel carried fuel at high pressure. By 1945, Pluto had delivered over 172 million gallons of gasoline. The pipeline reduced reliance on tankers that could be sunk by U-boats and freed up trucks for inland distribution. Coupled with the Red Ball Express and the eventual repair of French railways, Pluto ensured that fuel flowed steadily into Central Europe. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed the United States to supply allies with military and economic aid without immediate payment. As part of this program, America delivered arms, vehicles, and food to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies. The Soviet Union received thousands of tanks, aircraft, and trucks. 300,000 trucks, mostly Studebakers, played a significant role in Soviet offensives. Food shipments kept Soviet soldiers and civilians from starvation. British industries were sustained by shipments of steel, aluminum, and machine tools. The scale of Lend-Lease demonstrates that logistics was not merely a matter of feeding one's own troops but also of sustaining allies. It created a global network of supply that undermined Axis hopes of dividing and conquering. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought to protect these supply lines. German U-boats sank hundreds of cargo ships, but Allied convoy systems, radar, sonar, and long-range patrol aircraft gradually reduced the threat. Maritime production outpaced losses. The United States built more ships than the Germans could sink, thanks to assembly line techniques. Each Liberty ship required only a few weeks to construct. Shipyards operated around the clock, employing women and minorities who had never worked in heavy industry before. When a ship was torpedoed, another took its place within days. This resilience meant that supplies continued to flow despite the grim toll of the Atlantic campaign. Throughout this long exploration, we have seen that the decisive factor in World War II was not solely which side fielded the most formidable tanks or the fastest aircraft. It was which side could keep those tanks fueled, those aircraft maintained, and those soldiers fed and clothed through years of relentless fighting. German commanders designed brilliant operational plans but neglected the infrastructure needed to sustain them. They relied on horses when trucks were needed and believed wars could be won quickly. American planners, though sometimes overconfident, recognized that wars of attrition demanded a steady flow of material. They built factories, trained drivers, laid pipelines, and constructed ships. They integrated logistics into strategy. The result was that American armies could sustain offensive operations deep into enemy territory, while German armies stalled as soon as their supplies ran low. The Red Ball Express exemplifies this difference. It was an ad hoc solution born of necessity, executed with improvisation and determination. Black drivers, often denied glory and recognition, hauled jerrycans and ammunition day and night. Mechanics kept trucks rolling with wire and ingenuity. Commanders mapped routes and scheduled convoys. Together, they kept Patton's tanks moving and enabled the Allied advance. There were mistakes, frustrations, and tragedies, but there was also triumph in the mastery of a problem seldom celebrated in war narratives. More broadly, the United States' ability to mobilize its industrial base and create a global supply network determined the war's outcome. Synthetic rubber plants, Liberty and Victory ships, Lend-Lease shipments, and petroleum pipelines formed a web of resources that the Axis could not match. The myth that better weapons alone win wars has persisted because it is exciting and easy to dramatize. Yet the quiet work of engineers, dock workers, factory employees, and truck drivers did as much to defeat the Third Reich as any general. When we watch footage of bombed cities and tank battles, we should also remember the warehouses filled with rations and the convoys snaking through night, their cat eyes glowing faintly. Logistics is the art of making war sustainable. In closing, the reflection is not a call to action, but a quiet acknowledgement. The story of World War II logistics teaches us that endurance, systems, and planning matter as much as bravery and skill. Wars are won not only by courage, but by the ability to deliver. Those who laughed at American trucks failed to grasp that movement. The The simple act of getting from factory to front line decides the fate of armies. The Red Ball Express and the multitude of unsung logistic operations of the war remind us that the essence of modern conflict lies as much in supply yards as in battlefields. To understand the past fully, we must honor the drivers, stevedores, engineers, and workers who carried the weight of victory on their shoulders and in their hands.